Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a huge historical event today, one that, well, it still fascinates people, doesn't it? The fall of the Western Roman Empire.
Absolutely.
Now, if you're picturing the sudden, dramatic implosion, the sources we're looking at from SideBySide, they give a much more nuanced view.
They really do. Yeah, they make it very clear this wasn't some sudden crash. It's better to think of it maybe like a huge, intricate tapestry.
Okay.
And the threads holding it together just slowly started to unravel over centuries, really.
That image, the slow unraveling, that really sets the scene. We often point to 476 AD, right, as the end date. But that's just one moment near the end of a much, much longer process. The sources describe it as centuries of rot gnawing from within, while external pressures pressed relentlessly from without.
And that's exactly why seeing it as multifaceted is so critical. It wasn't just, one thing. It was this complex mix. Internal betrayals, devastating invasions, sure, but also crippling inflation, this growing disillusionment, political chaos, a deep spiritual transformation, and just widespread economic disaster.
So our mission here, for you listening, is to journey through those final centuries. We'll hit the barbarian invasions, definitely, but also dig into that deep internal decay, the economic mess, constant leadership crises, and honestly, just a sheer weight of the empire's own legacy.
Yeah, the burden of its own success, in a way.
We'll pull the key insights straight from the source material provided. Okay. Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
So to even start talking about the fall, you really have to appreciate just how enormous, how permanent Rome seemed at its peak.
Oh, absolutely.
Picture the empire, say, 2nd century AD. The sources paint this incredible picture stretching from Britain down to North Africa, all linked by roads, law, legions, trade flowing, cities vibrant.
It was undeniably powerful, a superpower for its time. But even then, the sources note that fractures were forming. Those seeds of vulnerability were already there.
How so?
Well, that huge size. Its greatest strength was also Achilles' heel, you could say.
Yeah.
How do you actually manage such diverse peoples, economies, military needs across that vast space effectively? It's a constant struggle.
And that struggle got put to a brutal test during the crisis of the 3rd century. That's roughly, 235 to 284 AD?
Yeah, around that time. And it was, as one source puts it, like Rome's first near-death experience, or maybe a dress rehearsal for the final act.
A dress rehearsal, I like that.
It really was chaotic. Just look at the symptoms.
Yeah.
Emperors coming and going, bang, bang, bang. Over 20 in just 50 years. Many assassinated.
Wow.
Endless civil wars, draining money and manpower, tearing the empire apart internally, plagues sweeping through. And crucially, the start of that spiraling inflation we mentioned. Rome pulled back from the brink somehow, but it was badly shaken, profoundly weakened.
And then came those big strategic decisions that reshaped everything, but maybe left the western half more vulnerable. Diocletian trying to stabilize things by splitting the empire east and west.
Right. And Constantine later shifting the main seat of power, the capital, eastward to Constantinople.
Now Byzantium.
Exactly. And that move, while maybe it strengthened the East, it undeniably left the Western Empire, more precarious. Its economy was weaker than the East's. Its frontiers were much more exposed to those outside pressures.
So the path to 476 AD starts looking a bit clearer after that split.
You could definitely argue it became much harder to avoid. Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to those external pressures. The classic image, right? Barbarians at the gates, just pouring in, overwhelming Rome. But the sources, they complicate that picture quite a bit. It wasn't that simple.
No, not at all. The sources really stress that many of these groups, Goths, Vandals, Huns, and others, they weren't always just, aggressive invaders looking to destroy. Often they were displaced peoples.
Fleeing their own problems.
Exactly. Fleeing pressures from the Huns pushing west or other conflicts. They were often looking for safety, for land, within the empire's borders.
Which must have created a really tricky, volatile relationship. Rome sometimes tried to integrate them, sometimes fought them.
Precisely. It was complex. But there were definitely key military moments, real shocks to the system, like the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD.
What happened there?
Adrianople was a disaster for Rome. A Gothic army basically wiped out a major Eastern Roman army, emperor and all. The source points out how this just shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility.
A huge psychological blow then.
Massive. And it echoed for decades.
And that shock became even more real, more visceral in 410 AD. When the Visigoths, under Alaric, they actually sacked Rome itself.
Yeah, Now, they didn't burn it to the ground completely, but the symbolism, the eternal city being breached and looted, unthinkable for centuries. The impact was enormous.
And then you have the Huns, right, under Attila.
The Huns, yeah. Their main impact wasn't so much conquering Rome directly. Attila turned back from the city itself, but their sheer destructive force destabilized huge parts of Europe.
Pushing other groups around.
Exactly. They put immense pressure on Germanic tribes, who then were pushed into Roman territory, seeking refuge or new lands. This just strained Rome's military and administration even further. It was already stretched thin.
Which leads eventually to another sack of Rome, maybe the most famous one, the Vandals in 455 AD.
That one was brutal. They looted the city for 2 solid weeks. So destructive, it actually gave us our modern word, vandalism.
Wow, I didn't realize that's where it came from.
Yeah. And central to dealing with all these groups was Rome's increasing reliance on, well, using them, hiring them.
As soldiers.
As soldiers.
Yeah.
Bringing groups in as Foederati allied troops. It seemed practical at first, maybe, but it blurred the lines of loyalty, of authority. The Roman army itself started depending heavily on what the sources call barbarian mercenaries.
And that caused problems.
Well, the sources argue it diluted discipline, diluted allegiance to the idea of Rome itself. Loyalty shifted more towards individual generals, often of the same ethnicity as the troops, rather than the emperor or the state.
It really makes you stop and think about that quote. The source includes from the historian Peter Brown. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. Rome had already destroyed itself. The barbarians merely walked over the rubble.
It's a powerful statement, isn't it? It suggests those external pressures were maybe just the final push against a structure that was already crumbling from the inside.
Yeah. And speaking of crumbling from the inside, while all this is happening at the borders, Rome's economy was going through, well, the sources call it an earthquake.
That's a good way to put it. By the 4th, 5th centuries, the state was described as financially exhausted, just running on fumes.
Think about it. How does the state pay its army, maintain roads, fund the bureaucracy? It all needs a functioning economy.
Right. And the source points out Rome's economy was basically cracking under its own weight.
What were the main cracks?
Well, one huge one was its fundamental structure, especially that over-reliance on slavery. For centuries, Roman expansion meant a constant flow of enslaved people. Super cheap labor for farms, mines, workshops.
But the conquests eventually stopped, right?
Exactly. As expansion slowed and then ended, that river of enslaved people dried up, and this hit agriculture, industry, everything. A key engine of the economy just stalled.
Then there's the classic problem, inflation. Hyperinflation even.
Yep. Emperors, desperate for cash to pay the army, fund the bureaucracy, they started debasing the currency, reducing the silver content, the gold content in the coins, making more coins, but with less valuable metal in them.
Which means?
Predictably, prices went through the roof. Confidence in the money just plummeted. People started reverting to barter. The whole economic system began to fracture. And the state, it found it harder and harder to collect taxes that were actually worth anything.
Which only made them more desperate for money, I imagine, leading to more taxes.
Crippling taxation, that's the sources call it. To squeeze out revenue, they levied heavier and heavier taxes, especially on landowners, the agricultural base.
And what did the landowners do?
The consequences were devastating. Many couldn't afford it or didn't want to pay. They simply abandoned their land, fled the tax collectors.
Leaving the land empty.
Or leaving the people who remained tied to the land in a state much like serfdom. And that crucial middle class, the merchants, the local officials, the backbone of city life, they were crushed. They disintegrated. Whole regions became depopulated.
So the picture the sources paint is just bleak. A brittle skeleton of an economy.
Yeah. Plagued by monopolies held by the powerful, rampant corruption, cities shrinking, trade routes neglected and dangerous, the countryside emptying out. It's grim.
It really serves as a cautionary tale, doesn't it? About overreach, mismanagement.
Absolutely. An empire can look mighty on the outside, but if the economic foundations are rotten, it just doesn't have the resilience to handle shocks, whether they come from outside or inside.
And beyond the money, there was this deep crisis in leadership, wasn't there? Who was actually, running the show. And did anyone even trust them anymore?
Well, the late Western emperors. Let's just say they weren't exactly figures like Augustus or Trajan.
No titans of leadership.
Far from it. They were often weak, didn't last long, described as figureheads for powerful generals or political puppets. The real power wasn't in the palace. It was with the military commanders out in the field.
And that led to constant coups, right? Generals just deciding who should be emperor.
Pretty much. Generals commanding the legions who held the real force would install or depose emperors almost at will.
Yeah.
Loyalty wasn't really to the idea of Rome anymore or the Senate. It was to these powerful strongmen commanding their specific armies.
And by the very end, it got even worse. The puppet emperors.
Yeah, you see this crystal clear with Romulus Augustulus, often called the last Western emperor. He was just a teenager, a figurehead. The real power was held by Germanic generals like Odoacer. The emperor was just a symbol, basically, not a ruler.
And adding to all this chaos was the friction between East and West, the two halves of the empire.
Right. Separate emperors, often with competing agendas, sometimes outright hostile to each other. It meant no unified strategy, constant suspicion, frequent succession crises, just more instability.
And all this unstable, weak leadership must have had an effect on society, on people's belief in Rome.
A huge corrosive effect. The sources talk about a real decay of Roman moral and civic ideals. Public service, once seen as a path of honor, became riddled with corruption. Patriotism, that sort of glue holding the state together, it just withered away.
Those old Roman virtues, discipline, honor, sacrifice for the republic, for the empire, they just faded.
Seemed to. Replaced by, well, apathy. Or just focusing on self-preservation. Why stick your neck out for a corrupt state? Why pay taxes if the money just disappears? Why fight for an emperor you don't believe in? When citizens stop believing, the whole structure gets shaky.
It makes that point the sources draw incredibly stark, doesn't it? Rome didn't fall in a year. It fell every time a senator accepted a bribe, every time a soldier deserted, every time a citizen stopped believing in Rome.
Exactly. It wasn't one event. It was this slow, cumulative failure of collective will, kind of enabled or at least made worse by failed leadership.
So it wasn't just the politics or the economy changing. The sources also point to big shifts in culture and spirit. The very soul of Rome was transforming.
Yeah, that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. And the most dramatic shift, undeniably, was the rise of Christianity.
From a persecuted minority
to the dominant religion of the empire, especially after Emperor Constantine's conversion and the policies that followed.
This was a huge change, a spiritual revolution, the sources call it.
Absolutely. Old pagan temples, symbols of Roman tradition for over 1,000 years, they were closed. Traditional religious practices faded. Societal values started aligning more and more with Christian ethics.
And how did that impact people's sense of being Roman, their civic identity?
Well, it was subtle, but significant. The old civic religion worshiping Jupiter, Mars, the traditional gods, was deeply tied into the state itself. It provided a kind of cultural, political unity. Yeah. When that declined, it left what the sources call a cultural vacuum.
Okay, so Christianity filled that vacuum, but maybe changed the focus.
In a way. Christianity obviously offered a powerful new sense of community, meaning hope, especially personal salvation. But the sources suggest this also involved a shift focus from civic duty to personal salvation.
Meaning less focus on the state.
Potentially. It wasn't necessarily negative in itself, but it represented a departure from that very intense, communal, military-focused civic participation that had really defined earlier Rome. The emphasis changed.
And the church itself became powerful.
Immensely powerful. It became a major institution, sometimes even competing with the state for influence and resources. Bishops became important political figures. The emperor's traditional role, sort of as chief priest, faded. Church and state, their relationship was often complex, sometimes tense.
So just to be clear, the sources aren't saying Christianity caused the fall.
No, not directly. It's presented more as a profound symptom of these deeper changes. A symptom of a loss of the old traditional identity, a transformation away from that specific communal military spirit that had built the empire in the first place. It's another key thread in that unraveling tapestry we talked about.
Okay, so you've got this perfect storm brewing, external pressures, economic collapse, really weak leadership, a decaying civic spirit, and this massive cultural and spiritual shift happening. By the mid-5th century, the sources say the Western Empire was basically a ghost of its former self.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to that date everyone knows, 476 AD. What actually happened then?
Well, Odoacer, that Germanic general we mentioned,
right.
He simply deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, took away his title, sent the imperial insignia east to Constantinople, basically saying, we don't need an emperor here anymore.
And the really striking part, the sources highlight this, is the lack of reaction. No legions marched to avenge him, no senators raised a cry.
It wasn't some epic final battle for Rome in 476.
No, it was almost quiet. An administrative change, almost anticlimactic in the West.
Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire,
centered in Constantinople, It didn't fall. It continued, adapted, transformed into what we call the Byzantine Empire, and it would endure for another 1,000 years, carrying on many Roman traditions, laws, governance.
But in the West, that unified political structure was gone. Administration dissolved, armies broke apart, cities declined further. The Western Roman Empire as a political entity ceased to exist.
And circling back to where we started, the sources really emphasize that 476 wasn't the cause of the fall. It was a moment it became undeniable that the Western half just could no longer hold itself together.
It was that pileup of everything we've discussed: internal decay, economic failure, leadership vacuum, cultural shifts, and those relentless external pressures.
Exactly. Any one of those factors, maybe Rome could have handled it, maybe, but all of them together, it was just too much, truly a death by 1,000 cuts.
Now, it is important, and the sources do this too, to complicate that narrative just a bit.
Yeah.
Not everyone just accepts the simple idea of a fall. There are other ways historians look at this period, right? Counterpoint.
Oh, definitely. One major perspective is often called the transformation theory.
Transformation, not fall.
Right. It argues Rome didn't vanish overnight. It evolved. Roman culture, laws, language, ways of life, they persisted, they changed, they blended into the new Germanic kingdoms that emerged in the West. It wasn't a sudden end, but a long transition.
And the sources point to evidence for this.
Yeah, things like Latin surviving and evolving into French, Spanish, Italian to Romanity, the Romance languages, Roman law forming the basis for legal systems across Europe for centuries, architecture, ideas, they endured.
Okay, what else?
And of course, there's the view from the East. The Eastern continuity perspective. For the people living in Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, Rome hadn't fallen at all.
It had just moved.
Exactly. The capital had moved east centuries before. The empire continued. To them, Rome hadn't fallen, just moved eastward. They saw themselves as Romans.
That's a really different perspective.
It is, and there's also the idea of the barbarians as builders, not just destroyers. Many of these groups who settled in the West, they actually admired Roman civilization.
They didn't just want to tear it all down.
Not always. The sources note they often admired and preserved Roman systems. They adopted Roman law, administrative techniques, sometimes even language and titles. Think of the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy under Theodoric, the Franks in Gaul, who would eventually build a new empire. They incorporated huge Roman elements.
So these different viewpoints, they remind us that history is complex. Collapse is rarely total and clean.
Exactly. Even something as massive as the end of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a clean break.
Yeah.
And Rome's legacy, its shadow, undeniably endured and continues to shape the world that grew out of its ruins. It's still with us.
So after digging into all these layers, this whole unraveling process, what's the big takeaway from this deep dive?
Well, I think it highlights that the fall of Rome wasn't just, the end of a political state. For people at the time, and even looking back, it felt like the end of an entire age, a sort of slow, tragic fading of the lights on a world order that had seemed permanent for centuries.
But the lessons from it, they feel very current.
They really do.
Yeah.
The sources make it incredibly clear. Even the mightiest, most seemingly invulnerable civilizations are vulnerable to internal decay, poor leadership, economic mismanagement, and loss of shared purpose. That hits home, doesn't it, when you look around today?
It really does. And Rome absolutely lives on, as you said, in our laws, languages, architecture, our whole idea of what a large state even is.
Yeah.
And that's why looking at this isn't just, an academic exercise about ancient history. Its lessons are timeless. No empire, no nation is somehow magically immune to the kinds of forces that brought down Rome.
And the sources leave us with a really powerful thought, suggesting that the fall of Rome is less a warning from history than a mirror held up to the present.
A mirror? Wow. So thinking about that mirror and how all Rome's problems were tangled together, the economy affecting the military, bad leadership fueling corruption, loss of purpose, weakening everything, what does that complex web tell you listening right now about trying to find simple, single answers to the really complex challenges we face in our own time?
Definitely something to ponder.
It is. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the unraveling of Rome.